second panel, big panel. I will introduce them, and you can come up and take your seats accordingly. Dr. Dariusz Leszczynski, a research professor at the Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in Helsinki, Finland. Holds professorships in China and at the University of Helsinki in Finland. He earned his PhD from the University of Helsinki, has lectured on the topic of mobile phones around the world, and has co-chaired 2 World Health Organization workshops on this issue. Dr. Siegal Sadetzki, I hope I pronounced that correctly. Not bad. The head of the Clinical Epidemiology Department at Sheba Medical Center and director of the Cancer and Radiation Epidemiology Unit at the Gertner Institute in Israel, which are affiliated with Tel Aviv University. Received her MD from the Technion Medical School in Haifa, a Master's of Public Health from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Dr. Sadetzki wrote the Israeli Ministry of Health guidelines for the use of cell phones in adults and children. Now we have Dr. Linda Erdreich. I hope that's, again, right. Dr. Erdreich, a senior management scientist for Exponent, an engineering and scientific consulting firm. She has 30 years of experience in environmental epidemiology and health risk assessment. Earned her PhD in epidemiology from the University of Oklahoma and an MS in biostatistics and epidemiology. Dr. Devra Lee Davis, I'm sure I got that right, is a professor of epidemiology at the University of Pittsburgh Graduate School of Public Health. She earned a PhD in science studies at the University of Chicago and an MPH in epidemiology at Johns Hopkins. She has served on numerous governmental and international advisory boards and recently wrote the book, quote, The Secret History of the War on Cancer, end quote. And lastly, Dr. Olga Naidenko. Did I get that right? Okay, Dr. Olga Naidenko, a senior scientist at the Environmental Working Group, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit organization, received her PhD in molecular biology and immunology from UCLA, was the lead author on the report issued last week by the Environmental Working Group on the topic of cell phone radiation. Can we welcome all of you here? We'll go Dr. Leszczynski, or Leszczynski or Leszczynski. We'll start with you, and then we'll just go down. Again, I'd ask you if you could, 5 to 7 minutes, something like that, if you could summarize it, because I'm sure we'd like to get into a discussion with each of you. And as I said, your statements will be made a part of the record in their entirety. Dr. Leszczynski, welcome, and please proceed. Punch the button.
Thank you for inviting me to this important hearing on topic of great concern to all of us. My name is Dariusz Leszczynski, and I'm a research professor at the Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in Finland. I'm also Guangbiao professor at the Zhejiang University in China and adjunct professor of biochemistry at the University of Helsinki in Finland. At this point, I would like also to thank Dr. Devra Davis, who made it possible for me to participate in this hearing. I have been working, doing basic laboratory experimental research in the field of biological and health effects of mobile phones for the past 10 years. The findings of my research group suggest that the mobile phone radiation might induce biological responses. However, these findings do not yet prove that there exists health hazard. My institution, Radiation and Nuclear Safety Authority in Finland, has issued 2 advisories for mobile phone users. The first advisory in 2004 as a part of the Nordic countries advisory that included Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway and Iceland. The second advisory in January 2009 was our own advisory focused on children using mobile phones. Children are of special concern because of their developing brain. Also, studies from industry and from academia suggest that children's brain is more exposed to mobile phone radiation than adult brain when using cell phone. Both advisories point out to the uncertainty of the scientific evidence and the need for precaution in the use of mobile phones. The intention of both advisories is not to discourage people from using the mobile phone technology. However, they remind us that there are still large gaps in the knowledge of the mobile phone radiation effects on humans. The currently available scientific evidence about the effects of radiation emitted by the mobile phones is contradictory. In each area of investigation, there are both studies showing effect and studies showing no effect. For details on this issue, I would like to refer you to my written statement. In the present situation of the scientific uncertainty, the statements that the use of mobile phones is safe are premature. And if I may repeat it, to make it certain that in the present situation of the scientific uncertainty, the statements that the use of mobile phones is safe are premature. In my opinion, the current safety standards are not sufficiently supported by science because of the very limited research on human volunteers, on children, and on the effects of long-term exposures in humans. This situation of uncertainty calls not only for precautionary measures, but also for further research. A part of the epidemiological, animal, and in vitro laboratory studies, we need a new direction in research. We need international, well-designed, comprehensive, molecular-level human volunteer studies. These studies should be aimed at proving or disproving whether human body responds to mobile phone radiation. In spite of years of research, we still do not have the answer to this basic question. However, obtaining research funds in this area is a major problem. Continuous assurances that there is no health risk that are coming from standard setting committees have caused that the funding agencies are reluctant to fund new research. For many years, Europe has led the way in mobile phone research because the funding was available there. Research community is hoping that the US will again get more involved in this much needed research by providing necessary funding. In the meantime, while waiting for this new research, because of the existing scientific uncertainty, it is wise to support the use of precautionary measures in everyday use of mobile phones, in order to, whenever reasonable possible, limit the body exposure to mobile phone radiation. Thank you for your attention, and I wait for your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Dr. Sadetzki, welcome. Please proceed. Please punch.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Punch the button.
I'm greatly honored to testify at this important hearing on a subject which affects a substantial proportion of the world population and which has great importance for public health. My full resume appears with my written testimony. I am a physician, board certified in epidemiology and public health. I am the director of the Cancer and Radiation Epidemiology Unit at the Gertner Institute, affiliated to Tel Aviv University. I'm involved in research, and I advise the Chief Director of the Ministry of Health on health policy concerning radiation and cancer. I'm currently engaged in collaborative studies of brain cancer funded, among others, by the NIH and the European Community. For over 10 years, I have been participating in research on the risk of tumors associated with cell phones, initially as the principal investigator of the Israeli part of the Interphone study, the largest collaborative study conducted today on this issue. And currently I lead the Israeli team of another study, also funded by the EU, on cell phones and children, called MobiKids. In 2008, we published findings from the Israeli finding of the Interphone study suggesting a risk of salivary gland, are located right here, salivary gland tumors among people who used cell phones for relatively long periods, when phone was usually held on the same side of the head where the tumor developed and when use was relatively heavy. The Israeli Ministry of Health adopted the precautionary principle that briefly says better safe than sorry. It published recommendations for several simple and low-cost measures. This is really important. The measures are very simple and very low-cost that should be taken to reduce exposure. I believe that the clever engineers that are out there in the industry can very easily find creative solutions for that. These measures include speakers, earphones, hands-free devices when driving, and, as you said before, reducing the use of cell phones in areas where reception is weak. Special attention was given to children because we have many proofs that the children population is specifically susceptible to carcinogenic effects. As said here before, guidelines have also been published in other countries such as France, Finland, and Canada, and others. Now, our findings are in line with some other studies of brain and acoustic neuroma. These are the nerve that controls hearing, that demonstrated an increased risk with more than 10 years of use and use on the same side of the head as the tumor. However, there is a debate among scientists, and this is where we are today, whether these observations are true or stem from methodological issues of epidemiological studies in general and those on cell phones specifically. I also appreciate these methodological issues. I suspect the results, but I respect the results primarily, the results that we have. I would like to explain one important point which illustrates the limitations of the existing data. I think it's an important point. During a duration of at least 10 years is the minimal time needed for solid cancer studies. In the case of brain tumors, it may reach even 30 to 40 years. For example, the atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred in 1945, while the first report demonstrating brain tumors among the survivors was not published until 1994, 50 years later. For leukemia, it was published during the 50s, and for other solid tumors, it began to show in the 60s. Since widespread cell phone use began only in the mid-90s, the follow-up period in most published studies is only about 10 years, which is insufficient to detect an effect. Since then, the amount of time people spend on cell phones has increased dramatically. There is a consensus that additional research is needed. As the United States has always been a leader in medical research, your making this topic a high priority would advance progress in this field. A multidisciplinary, multinational effort built on previous research is essential. I think this is very important, not to invent the wheel, but to learn from the past experience. There are now 4 billion people using this technology, including children. Consequently, even if a small risk for an individual exists, the great number of users could eventually result in a great damage. Until definite answers are available, some public health measures with special emphasis on children should be instituted. Preventive steps used for other technologies, such as driving, provide a good example. We all use cars, but in order to reduce the risks of accidents, legislation was passed concerning the use of seat belts, airbags, speed limits, minimum age of driving, and car tests. I think it's exactly the same thing. I believe that cell phone technology, which has many advantages, is here to stay. However, the question, as far as I'm concerned, the question that needs to be answered is not whether we should use cell phones, but how we should use them. And that's very easy to address, I think. It is my hope that the issue raised in this hearing will encourage you to promote research and take actions to ensure the safe and responsible use of cell phones. I would like to thank Dr. Devra Davis, who invited me here, and I would like to thank you for your attention and for raising this issue.
Dr. Sadetzki, thank you very much for coming a great distance, and thank you for your testimony. Now we move to Dr. Linda Erdreich. I got it right. Welcome, and please proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon.
Now you still have to punch that button.
Thank you. Hi. I have been asked by the CTIA to appear today to provide my independent assessment of the science related to potential health effects from wireless phones. I'm a senior managing scientist in Exponent's Health Sciences Center, I have 30 years of experience in environmental epidemiology and health risk assessment. I earned a PhD in epidemiology from the University of Oklahoma, and I have a Master of Science in Biostatistics and Epidemiology. Much of my work includes assessing epidemiological research and integrating this information with that from other disciplines for determining whether human exposure can present a hazard to human health. At the Environmental Protection Agency, I evaluated research related to chemical contaminants of air and water. These health evaluations were used to develop standards such as ambient water quality standards, exposure limits. I have prepared evaluations for chemicals, for radio frequency energy, for electric and magnetic fields, and I've published in the peer-reviewed literature. Since 1991, I have been particularly active in updating standards regarding non-ionizing radiation, which includes radio frequency energy like that from wireless phones. I've served on advisory committees to government and regulatory organizations regarding health evaluations of chemicals and of electromagnetic fields. A little bit of background on cellular phones, that mobile phones operate using radio waves. Radio waves, also known as radio frequency energy, is a range on the electromagnetic spectrum that includes broadcast radio, television, and other devices, including cordless phones, baby monitors, radar, and microwave ovens. Visible light is also part of this spectrum, but is at a higher frequency and shorter wavelength than RF. Radio frequency energy is not radiation in the same sense as for high-frequency X-rays, because the energy of RF is lower and unable to change the DNA of cells. There is a standard scientific approach used to determine whether an exposure source, such as radio frequency energy, poses a health risk. This process first requires that all of the published literature be considered, which will include studies that reported effects as well as those that have not. This is the method that I've used for evaluating the radio frequency research and for other assessments throughout my career. In this process, after the literature is compiled, each study is evaluated to assess its strengths and weaknesses, and more emphasis given to studies of better quality because they'll be more reliable. The purpose of this comprehensive review is to be objective. This approach is designed to ensure that reviewers do not single out studies consciously or inadvertently to support a preconceived opinion. As for any health assessment, the relevant research includes many different methods. As we've heard today, this includes laboratory studies in cells, studies in animals, experimental studies of human volunteers, and epidemiological studies in human populations. Each of these approaches has its own specific strength and limitation, and together the studies provide complementary information. And numerous studies using these different approaches have been conducted over the past 50 years regarding RF and health. Several scientific organizations, and these include government agencies as well as professional organizations, have used this procedure to assess the potential for health effects from RF exposure. And some of them have set exposure limits to ensure safety of the public and of workers. These expert groups usually include scientists with different skills to reflect the different research expertise required to answer questions about potential health effects. While the conclusions vary, all of the agency reports that assess the evidence using a comprehensive approach reach similar conclusions, that the current scientific evidence does not demonstrate that wireless phones cause cancer or other health effects. A few examples follow. The agencies that have regulatory authority over radio frequency emissions in the United States are the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA. And they've both reached similar conclusions. The FCC concluded there's not scientific evidence that proves that wireless usage can lead to cancer or other problems. And the FDA states the weight of scientific evidence has not linked cell phones with health problems. The conclusions of these agencies are similar to conclusions reached by commissions around the world, including, for example, the Health Council of the Netherlands, which published a report in 2008. Now, the European Commission has a committee called the Scientific Committee on Emerging and Newly Identified Health Risks. and they wrote a report on RF. The World Health Organization has an ongoing review process. The Australian Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency has recently posted statements on its website, and the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, the International Committee on Electromagnetic Safety, reviewed this in 2005 and is in the process of updating its review. But the most recent one was in 2009. The International Commission of Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection has reviewed all of the evidence, and one section of its report is an epidemiological study by Dr. Album in 2009. In his summary, he wrote, "In the last few years, the epidemiologic evidence on mobile phone use and risk of brain and other tumors of the head has grown considerably. In our opinion," this is the ICNIRP, "in our opinion, overall, the studies published to date do not demonstrate a raised risk within approximately 10 years of use for any tumor of the brain or any head tumor." Based on my review of the epidemiological studies and consideration of the experimental data, I concur with the conclusions of the scientific organization. The current evidence does not demonstrate that phones cause cancer or other adverse health effects.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be here today, especially as I haven't seen the two of you together since my confirmation hearings some time ago with the National Chemical Safety and Hazard Investigation Board. My background is in the record, and my statement is as well. I'm going to speak to you today as a scientist, as a citizen, and as a grandmother. I am deeply concerned about the violation of a basic human right when it comes to where we are in cell phone research today. Democracy, as you know very well, rests on the right to know, on the freely given consent of the governed to be governed. I would submit that where we lack information about the potential hazards of a widespread technology, our basic right to know is being violated. We have to ask, why are other governments issuing the warnings? Why are the governments of Finland and Israel, which are no strangers to radar or electromagnetic technologies, why are they issuing concerns about this particular issue? I think, as you began your remarks, Senator Harkin, about tobacco, it's important for us to recognize that there's no one in this room today who doubts that we should have acted sooner about tobacco. Now, when we should have acted, one can debate. But as I say in my book, we certainly could have acted in the 1950s. And when President Nixon started the war on cancer in 1971, an admirable act, he ignored tobacco, although the Surgeon General had warned about its dangers in 1964. I think it's fair to say we don't have a level playing field in this issue, and the absence of definitive epidemiologic evidence is not proof that there's not a problem. Rather, it's a reflection of the fact that we do not have a level playing field. That the United States today has not published a new epidemiologic study on brain cancer and cell phones since 2002. That although the NIH budget doubled under Senator Specter's leadership in 5 years, the budget for the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences has only recently doubled. It took 11 years, sir, to get there. And that is the institute that is charged with doing this study. I would point out the study we heard about from Dr. Bucher was originally proposed in 2002, and now we hear that because of delays, which I think I need not tell you why they occurred, because of those delays, the study results will not be available to 2014. And we are talking about a technology that affects every single one of us, whether we're users or inadvertently exposed. Now, Dr. Sadetzki has told you, I think, in considerable detail why epidemiology is difficult. I want to add that the Hiroshima data involved a single exposure to an atom bomb that took 40 years before you could find an effect. We're talking about cell phones that many of us are using all the time. And children are using at unprecedented levels, and we have never been exposed to this level in our lives. I want to also tell you, unfortunately, that there has been a history here that I think we need to recognize. When Professor Henry Lai and Singh developed the pioneering new technique for measuring DNA damage called the COMET assay that shows you a tail of DNA when it's damaged, they developed that in 1994. If they'd been more modest, it would have been called the lie and sing assay, but it's called the comet assay. Professor Lai is with us here today. When they developed that assay in 1994, they showed that radiofrequency exposure to brain cells of the rat could be damaging in terms of the comet assay. The industry response, which has been documented and is in my book as well as other places, was this. First, they went to NIH and tried to get their funding revoked. Then they went to the journal that had accepted the article for publication and tried...
Who they?
The industry working against seeing this work published. Okay, and I have the details and the names of the PR firms and the individuals who wrote the memos in my book, which I'll be happy to attach for the record. Then the same lobbyists tried to get the article unaccepted in a journal where it had been accepted. And finally, they hired other scientists to do advocacy research to try to invalidate the science. And when those scientists actually confirmed the work, it was never published. A similar story can be told today in Europe about a major multi-million-dollar EU-supported study called the REFLEX program that was a multi-laboratory study in many countries that also showed evidence that radiofrequency signal at precisely the level of today's phones could damage DNA, contrary to the assertion that only ionizing radiation can damage DNA. And those researchers were also subject to the same kinds of attack and have recently been exonerated by an independent review by the Medical University of Vienna. So I think it's clear the United States needs to catch up. We need to catch up with our European allies and see that we issue warnings for our children as well. And I have a very simple proposal. We definitely need major research on this issue. Unlike tobacco, almost everybody in the world is using a cell phone today. We need research desperately, but how are we going to fund that in this difficult time? I have a simple proposal. We can place a $1 user fee on a cell phone every year for 3 years. There's not one parent in this room that wouldn't like to know what a cell phone will mean for their child's brain in the future. And that $1 fee should support international and independent research, because unfortunately we have not had independent research in this area. And finally, I believe it's appropriate at this time to ask the FDA and the FCC to review existing standards. Existing standards for cell phones are based on causing heat, avoiding the acute injury of a thermal effect. And the way phones are used today, for periods, unfortunately, in some cases of hours, it's time for us to move beyond that to a new approach. I thank you both very, very much for your interest in this. I think you've done the world a great service by bringing us together. And I want to say I am not alarmed. I am concerned because the world has changed very rapidly, and we have a right to know what that change may mean for our health and that of our grandchildren. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Davis. Now we turn to Dr. Naidenko, and I'm going to get over here with the Environmental Working Group, and I might just say that we'd called this hearing at suggestion of Senator Spector, as I said earlier, before this study came out last week. I just want to make the record clear on that. Please proceed. Mr. Naidenko.
Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the subcommittee, my name is Olga Nadenko and I am a senior scientist at Environmental Working Group, a non-profit research and advocacy organization based in Washington, D.C., Ames, Iowa, and Oakland, California. I thank the subcommittee for holding this important hearing and for the opportunity to testify. Last week, EWG released the results of a 10-month investigation of more than 200 peer-reviewed studies, government advisories, and industry documents on the safety of cell phone radiation. We found that the studies published during the first 2 decades of cell phone use produced conflicting results and few definitive conclusions on cell phone safety. But the latest research, in which scientists are for the first time able to study people who have used cell phones for many years, suggests the potential for serious safety issues. The state of the science is provocative and troubling, and more research is essential. We at Environmental Working Group are still using our cell phones, but we also believe that until scientists know much more about cell phone radiation, it's smart for consumers to buy phones with the lowest emissions. We are moving to a mobile society. Cell phones, handheld devices are now part of everyday life. As of December 2008, US wireless subscribers numbered 270 million, a 30% jump in 3 years. As the market for new devices has grown, so has the urgency that cell phone safety be well understood and that cell phone radiation standards be sufficient to protect public health. EWG advocates that cell phone companies label their products' radiation output so that consumers can make informed choices at the point of sale, and that the government requires this disclosure. Currently, most people are given no information at all about radiation emissions when they purchase a phone. To fill this information void, EWG's research team created an interactive online consumer guide to cell phone radiation, covering over 1,200 phones. In the 64 hours following the publication of our science review and cell phone radiation database, 442,000 people accessed our website. During those same 3 days, our findings were reported in numerous news articles and broadcast news. This powerful response from the public reflects the consumer's keen interest in the issue of cell phone safety. Much more research is essential. However, in response to the information already available over the potential health risks of cell phone radiation, government agencies in 6 different countries have recommended actions to help consumers reduce exposures to cell phone radiation, especially for young children. For example, in 2005, United Kingdom Department of Health stated in a consumer advisory, quote, UK chief medical officers strongly advise that where children and young people do use mobile phones, they should be encouraged to use mobile phones for essential purposes only. Keep all calls short. Talking for long periods prolongs exposure and should be discouraged. In contrast, the Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Communications Commission have all but ignored evidence that long-term cell phone use may be risky. The FCC set cell phone radiation standards 17 years ago, when few people used cell phones. The standards fail to provide an adequate margin of safety for cell phone radiation exposure and do not account for risks to children. Until the science on cell phone risks is settled, EWG recommends a number of simple actions consumers can take to reduce exposures to cell phone radiation, including use a low radiation phone, use a headset or a speakerphone, choose texting over talking, and limit children's cell phone use. In conclusion, EWG strongly believes that the government should support additional research into this important health question, and that the public has a right to know what levels of radiation they may be exposed to, what may be the potential risks, and what precautionary measures consumers can take to protect themselves and their families from any adverse health effects of cell phone radiation. Thank you for your time. I welcome the opportunity to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Dr. Naidenko, and I'll just start the first round of questioning here. You can start me at 5. Thank you. Dr. Naidenko, I was looking at the summary of your working group study last week. You had a tracking tool that allows visitors to check radiation levels for 1,200 models of cell phones and smartphones. And is that list available? Can I look and see what models would be lowest and what would be highest?
Thank you for this question, Senator. Yes, the full database is available for consumers, for anybody, on the EWG website. It's searchable. Consumers can look for a specific model, look for the phones with highest radiation output, lowest radiation output. So it is a tool that has had immense success over the 4-5 days since it has been released.
You also say your finding was that texting trumps talking. That was your first tip right here. But texting costs money. costs more money than talking on the phone. But you right on cue. Are you going to answer? Okay. But so you would say that still to text rather than talk, but I just want to point out that texting can be very expensive.